just watching, is the world going to blow up? We're in a situation where it looks like the Saudis and the Qataris, they hold the veto on whether or not this war is going to expand, or if it's going to, be brought to an end with Iran in control of the Strait of Hormuz. So I'm hopeful that the Saudis will recognize that there's not a viable path forward if they pursue additional attacks against Iran or allow the United States to carry out attacks. It's going to be devastating for them. I think Iran is feeling actually more confident with each passing day, in part because of the efforts of Russia and China to build this new security architecture. It's not getting a lot of attention around the world, but there is definite activity on that front. That's not just idle talk. It's talk backed with action. So we'll see. This week. I believe this week could be one of the most decisive weeks in the entire 12-week conflict. You read me on the Matrianos take, and it sounds like he got some better information than I had access to. But that this entire plant facility was blown up, and it wasn't done by an attack by Iran. Rather, they did something wrong in handling the explosives that were being produced inside that factory. And boy, apparently it wiped it off the face of the earth. So that's significant. And I surmised my hypothesis about why this happened is that Israel had decided to try to upgrade or expand one of its weapon systems or push to develop and get a new air defense system out, because they know that a new attack on Iran is coming, and that they were being, these folks are being pressured to hurry. We need to hurry. And sometimes when you rush certain things like that, accidents can happen. That's appeared to be what happened, but I'd be happy to be proven wrong, but that was not your normal. It was not your normal explosion. But prior to, we had 5 weeks of missile attacks by Iran, and we never, ever saw any missile hit that caused that kind of explosion and that massive mushroom cloud that came up out of that factory. So this was significant.
If a strike really was carried out on a factory producing key components for Israel's missile systems, this could signal not just a localized incident, but a potential blow to the country's entire defense architecture. But that raises the question, why is this being barely covered in the media, and could the scale of the consequences be far greater than what is being shown to the public?
Yeah, well, when you get a disaster like that, it's you don't want to necessarily go around and advertise it, but it does appear to be quite significant. That if that's where they develop all the rocket motors, et cetera, well, you're going to have rocket fuel around to test those motors. And again, this one thing said this was a test, but the only kind of tests we've seen like that was when we were testing nuclear bombs or atomic bombs back in the 50s, and they'd blow up like the Bikini Atoll. And yeah, there's a test, that island's gone. But I don't think this was, that kind of test.
If there are two competing proposals on the table, one from the United States and a 14-point response from Iran, but they fundamentally diverge on the nuclear issue, then it suggests negotiations are becoming more about signaling than actual convergence. At the same time, with military buildups accelerating and rhetoric like "the clock is ticking," the risk of escalation seems to be increasing rather than decreasing. So the question is, are these proposals still genuine diplomatic efforts? Or are they simply being used to justify preparation for a new round of conflict?
Oh, it's very, the U.S. plans are locked and loaded. It's just a matter of, is Trump going to give the execute order? That's all they're waiting for. So the holdup, I believe, is with the Saudis and Qataris and Kuwaitis, because we saw 2 weeks ago when the Saudis and Kuwaitis told the United States, no, you're not going to use our airspace for your Project Freedom. Not going to happen. And Trump had to call it off. He said, oh, well, we're pausing it. Okay, good pause. It's been shut down for 2 weeks now. It's more than a pause. It was canked, to put some military vernacular. So the decision now to restart the war, the only viable option for the United States is air power. And let me explain why the Saudis in particular can derail this by not allowing the KC-135s, which are based in Prince Saud Air Base, PSAB. I found that out the other day by talking to one of my neighbors whose son is a pilot, flies KC-135s, and kids based at Prince Saud Air Base. And they told his dad, man, this situation is terrible. We don't have protection. It's just, it's awful. But the reason the United States needs that is I think most of the F-35s, the combat jets that will carry JASSM missiles or Tomahawk missiles and launch those, they're based in Jordan and in Israel. Well, the distance from Mawafaq Al Salti Air Base in Jordan to Riyadh is 819 miles. The combat radius of those F-35 is about 550 miles. So, you're 300 miles shy, you're going to run out of gas before you even get to Riyadh. So that means those planes have to be refueled at least one, they're going to be refueled at a minimum 2 times and maybe more in order to get them. So let's say you're going to fly to the coast, to the middle of the Persian Gulf, and you're going to launch your JASSM or Tomahawk from there, because you launch away from, they're not going to fly over Iran and drop bombs. The odds are they'll get shot down. But they do the standoff, and Iran has less protection against that. Remains to be seen if Iran's made any improvements towards defeating JASSM and Tomahawk missiles. But they got to be refueled. And then, because let's say the total distance from Mawafaq to the point of the Persian Gulf is 1,000 miles. Okay, right there, that's 2 air refueling and 1,000 miles back. So those planes would have to be refueled as many as 4 times per plane. And if you're launching 20 aircraft or 30 aircraft, let's say it's 20, that's 80 refuelings that these planes have to take care of. And so, it becomes a complex logistics operation. So if the Saudis say, no, you're not using our air bases to refuel that aircraft as they can attack Iran. No, we'll stop in that. The attack doesn't happen. So that's what, I don't know what we'll know probably by Wednesday or Thursday at the latest, if the Saudis have made that kind of decision or not. Because if they decided to go along with the United States, then I fully expect that the new renewed attacks on Iran could start as soon as tomorrow. But if they don't have the air logistics sorted out and access to fly over Saudi or Qatari airspace, then it could be put on hold. And the longer it's on hold, the more opportunity for the diplomatic solution. And what I mean by that is what China and Russia are proposing. In fact, the United States is actually sort of irrelevant to it, because the Chinese and Russian proposal is to bring together Turkey, Saudis, and Iran into a strategic regional alliance that they would agree to protect the interests of all the countries in that region, except for Israel. I mean, it leaves Israel on the outs. But the fundamental premise in that new security architecture is the United States has got to get the hell out of the Persian Gulf, remove its bases, remove its personnel. Now, that's already happened in a de facto manner, just by virtue of the military activity during the first 5 weeks of the war. that and now it is, it's the United States just doesn't go back out and reoccupy some of these spaces because they've been virtually destroyed.
If reports about 2 secret Israeli bases operating in Iraq are accurate, then this would raise serious questions not only about regional escalation, but also about violations of international law and sovereignty. Especially if their purpose is not linked to Iraq itself, but to operations targeting Iran through indirect pressure or internal destabilization. So the key question is, how does such a military footprint in a third country reshape the conflict dynamics? And why is this dimension of the story almost never addressed in mainstream discussions?
Yeah. You mean Israel's concerned about international law? And your evidence for that is? Nothing. Look, I was in a conversation with Mario Nafal yesterday because he was saying, hey, you've had these drone attacks that came from the West. It wasn't coming from Israel or from Iran. And I said, well, gee, is it possible that Israel could have a secret base in Iraq and launch drones from there to try to make it look like it's something from an Iranian proxy, when in fact it's Israel trying to provoke, let's call it a false flag? And you go, yeah, there's a possibility there. So Iran right now holds the cards. They're in a superior position because I'll call it playing the victim, by not initiating contact. You could very well justify that they could have taken preemptive strikes. They had the intelligence. They knew the U.S. was coming. They knew Israel was coming. So they could have launched some preemptive strikes. They didn't. Yes. Did they suffer damage as a result? Yes, absolutely. You can, in fact, say maybe those schoolgirls would not have been killed had Iran launched a preemptive strike. That's one possibility. But by adopting that role, they've made it very, very clear to the world. They're the victim here. We didn't start this. We were not using military force against Israel or the United States. We've only done it in self-defense. It is, in that regard, they've acquired what I say the moral high ground, and it's bolstered their support from countries like China and Russia. So again, they recognize there's all this buildup and energy on the part of the U.S. and Israel to renew the attacks, and I don't see Iran lashing out in advance. They're ready. They're going to retaliate. But they're not going to initiate. So that's where I saw these attacks on, the apparent drone attack on a nuclear facility in United Arab Emirates. I think it's a false flag. It's an attempted provocation back, by Israel to try to provoke. They want this war to get going because they still believe somehow they can defeat Iran, and they can't, but they still believe it.
If Israel calls the UAE a close ally but is still conducting actions that appear to harm or pressure it indirectly, that suggests a gap between public diplomacy and real strategy. So is this actually an alliance or just temporary cooperation driven by shifting interests?
I wouldn't rule that out. Yeah, it is. Look, the Intercept just put out an article about the Emirati ambassador to the United States. Oh my God! He makes Hugh Hefner of the Playboy Empire look like a Benedictine monk. This guy is really a sexual predator, a hedonist, a trafficker, and at the same time, they claim to try to impose certain restrictive Muslim practices, so-called Muslim practices, and restricting interaction between men and women. It's a level of hypocrisy that is just staggering once you begin to comprehend what's been going on. the United Arab Emirates is a real outlier because particularly Dubai. It is completely emblematic of everything that's sick and wrong with the West. Ostentatious displays of wealth up against appalling levels of poverty and deprivation on the part of workers who have to support that lifestyle. Consumption culture. And we're not just talking about food and alcoholic beverages, the sexual deviancy, it was celebrated there. And, this has been one of the consequences of this war with Iran. That whole lifestyle is being threatened, undermined, destroyed. So, I can see from the Iranian standpoint that there is absolutely zero empathy with the United Arab Emirates. Maybe with some of the sheikhs within the sort of Emirati collective, because it's not just one. There are several emirs. Not all of them share the same vision. But Iran is serious about creating a new security arrangement in the Gulf. And, you and I were talking off air before you came on with the new X site that the Persian Gulf, or PSGA, is it called? The Persian Strait Gulf Authority or something. So they're setting up a formal mechanism for controlling the traffic that comes in and out of the Strait of the Persian Gulf. And the flow of that traffic is essential to the world's economy. And as long as this U.S. blockade persists, it takes Iran off the hook, because it's not Iran that's hindering the flow of those goods. It's the United States. Crazy. I don't know what the targets are. All I know is the targets were selected and are plugged in, ready to go as of at least 5 weeks ago. So it's not like they're now scrambling, let's come up with some targets. No, they've already got those. Now, this is where it gets interesting. If the Israelis and or the United States decide to try to attack Iran's power grid, I'm sure they can knock out portions of that in the country. But Iran, as you know, is a big, big country. And there's not just one central node that you take that out and the whole country falls apart. No, absolutely not. Just the opposite. Whereas Israel is vulnerable because of its small size relative to Iran. There, you can knock out 2 or 3 nodes, and all of a sudden you're going to put that country into darkness. And Israel can't survive with that kind of situation. And up to this point, Iran had avoided attacking those sites. So it really, it depends on what Israel and the United States decide to attack in Iran, because Iran will retaliate in kind. So if they go after power grids, then Iran's going to take out the power grids in Israel. If they go after any more of the refineries, and it won't be just in Israel. I mean, it will be in the Persian Gulf. Right now is like if you take out some of the power producing capabilities in Saudi Arabia or Qatar right now, all of a sudden you're going to have a human catastrophe on your hands, because the daily temperatures are soaring well into the 100 degrees Celsius range. So it gets hot. And if you don't have electricity, you don't have air conditioning, you may not have water purification. So a whole number of cascading effects that would compel people to have to start leaving the area. And, and I think that's another consideration that's in the back of the mind of the Saudis and Qataris, that, they know that the United States cannot protect them from Iranian retaliation. So therefore, as long as they don't get involved with the fight, they don't have anything to worry about, but except the possibility of an Israeli false flag to have them attacked in a way that they think, it's Iran, so we got to retaliate or we have to cooperate.
Well, I think what he hoped to achieve more than anything else was to get some cooperation from the Chinese to help shut down the Iran war. I mean, he's desperate to find a solution to the Iran war. He can't seem to come up with one. And I think he was hoping that the Chinese would help him to put pressure on Iran and help us get a deal there. He did not make any progress on that front. I think the Chinese, for their part, wanted Trump to make some concessions or soften his position on Taiwan. That's the central issue for them. And that really didn't happen either. So on the Taiwan issue, the Iran issue, you didn't get much. In terms of trade, it appears that we got a few goodies involving Boeing aircraft and agricultural goods. It's hard for me to tell exactly what we got and where that all ends up. I think, if anything, what Trump would like to have had happen with regard to trade was to get China to loosen up on selling rare earths to the United States. We desperately need rare earths, and the Chinese control that market, and they're playing hardball with us in terms of giving us rare earths. And this has huge consequences, not only from an economic point of view, but from a strategic point of view, because you can't build all sorts of weapons unless you have lots of rare earths. And we're in an exposed position there. But Trump doesn't appear to have made much progress on that front either. So I don't think much happened here. I don't think any of us were expecting much to happen beforehand. There wasn't a lot of preparation. There wasn't a lot of talk about breakthroughs on the foreign policy front or on the economic front. And therefore, what happened is hardly surprising.
Did Trump expect Xi Jinping to pressure Iran? Did Trump leave Beijing realizing that China would help contain escalation, but not help dismantle Iran the way some in Israel may have hoped?
I think that Trump got the message that the Chinese are not going to bring the Iranians to their knees, that they're not going to try to bring the Iranians to their knees, that China would like, there's no question China would like that war to shut down. China benefits in some ways from the war because the United States is pinned down in this conflict. It's pinned down in the Middle East, and it has already expended and may expend even more precious munitions that therefore can't be used in East Asia to contain China. That's good from China's point of view. But I think economically, this is a potential problem of great significance for the Chinese, because if the international economy continues to head towards the cliff, or God forbid goes off the cliff, this will have hugely negative consequences for the Chinese economy. You want to remember that the Chinese economy is heavily dependent on exports. And given that they export manufactured goods all over the world, if countries around the world are in deep economic trouble and can't buy Chinese manufactured goods, that will have an obvious negative effect on the Chinese economy. So I think when you look at the bottom line, the Chinese would like to solve this war. They'd like to shut it down, but they're not in a position to do it. Trump is the only person who could really shut it down at this point by making concessions to the Iranians, which he apparently is unwilling to do. It's very important to understand that the 11 billion has already been authorized. We're now talking about another 14 billion. There's sort of two waves here. The first wave, the $11 billion wave, is taken care of, as I understand it. The $14 billion wave is still up in the air. And I think that eventually Trump will authorize that money. It will anger, maybe enrage is a better word, the Chinese. But what can they do about it? They're not going to start a war over Taiwan. And Trump will surely go to great lengths to make sure that that doesn't happen, because he has no interest in getting into a war in East Asia over Taiwan. But I think at this point in time, it's hard for me to imagine Trump backing off on Taiwan.
Taiwan is clearly a core issue for China. So much so that Xi Jinping reportedly raised it before anything else, signaling its top priority status. So the question is, did Trump fully grasp that Taiwan isn't just another topic, but a red line Beijing won't compromise on under any circumstances?
There's no question that Taiwan is an incredibly important issue for virtually every Chinese person. Anybody who's been to China and has talked to the Chinese, and I'm not talking just about the leadership here, I'm talking about the average Chinese person on the street, knows full well that getting Taiwan back and making it part of China is of enormous importance to them. It is sacred territory. It was originally taken by the Japanese in the War of 1894, 1895, and the Chinese want it back desperately. It also has significant strategic value for China, which of course is one of the reasons the United States does not want Taiwan to go back to China. But there's no question that this is a hot button issue for the Chinese. And that's what makes it so dangerous. I mean, it's important to understand that who controls Taiwan matters significantly for strategic reasons. But when you talk about Chinese nationalism, how the Chinese think about Taiwan in terms of it being sacred territory, you see it's a doubly dangerous situation.
Why is the U.S. in decline while China is on the rise?
Well, it's simply because going back to the early 1990s, the American economy was far superior in strength to the Chinese economy. And we pursued from the early 1990s up until about 2017 a policy of engagement, which was designed to help China become an economic powerhouse. Both the Clinton administration and the Bush administration worked overtime to get China into the World Trade Organization in 2001. And this just fueled Chinese growth in the early 2000s. And even though we switched from this policy of engagement to a policy of containment roughly in 2017, nevertheless, the Chinese economy has continued to grow by leaps and bounds. It's truly impressive. Now, over the course of the period from the early 1990s up to the present, the United States economy has grown in impressive ways as well. But it has not grown as impressively as the Chinese economy has grown. Therefore, the Chinese have closed the gap with the United States in terms of wealth and in terms of their ability to develop sophisticated technologies. It's not like we're standing still and that we're in deep trouble because we can't compete. We can compete, but we're competing with a rising power. And that rising power, by the way, has over 4 times as many people as us. So when you hypothesize a situation where they have 4 times as many people as us, and they have a tremendous amount of wealth, and they have the ability to develop sophisticated technologies that are at least as good as ours, if not better, we're in deep trouble. And that's the situation that we're in today. We're dealing with a peer competitor like we've never seen before. Donald Trump, to his credit, understood when he first moved into the White House in 2017 that the policy of engagement had, in effect, created a formidable adversary that we were going to have a lot of trouble dealing with over time. You want to remember, it's Trump who abandoned engagement and adopted containment as a policy. I think that was a smart thing to do. I know lots of people don't think that, but Trump was the person who did it, and he recognized that China was a looming threat. The problem with Trump is that during the rest of his first term, but especially during his second term, he has behaved on the foreign policy front in ways that have weakened our ability to contain China. As I like to say, because of the war in Iran, we're not pivoting to Asia as he once wanted to do. We're actually pivoting away from Asia so we can fight this foolish war against Iran. The Ukraine crisis started in 2014, and that's when we started inadvertently pushing the Russians close to the Chinese. And then when the actual fighting broke out big time in February of 2022, that went a long way towards pushing the Russians into the arms of the Chinese. And now we have a situation, by the way, if you look at the war in Iran, where the Iranians, the Russians, and the Chinese all have a vested interest in working together against the United States. From Iran's point of view, obviously, but I think also from China's point of view and from Russia's point of view, the United States is a mortal enemy. They have to go to great lengths to make sure they don't do anything foolish. So they weaken their position vis-a-vis the United States. And that means that those three countries are coordinating with each other. I'm sure that when Putin goes to China, and I believe he's arriving today, that he and Xi will have much more cordial relations, much more friendly relations than Trump had with Xi. And I believe that both Putin and Xi will be talking about how they can work together to thwart President Trump's aggressive foreign policy toward them and toward Iran. And I thought maybe yesterday that you and I would be talking about the new bombing campaign on the show, but obviously that didn't happen. He called it off, as he's done so many times before. He said that he talked to three of the key states in the Gulf, Saudi Arabia being one of them, I think the UAE and Qatar were the other two. And the three of them asked him, this is Trump's story, asked him to postpone the attack because great progress was being made in the negotiations. I think that's not true. I don't think that great progress is being made. I think that Trump called off the attack, number one, because those three countries and probably a number of other countries begged him not to attack because they knew what would happen to them if the air war started again. But also because Trump understands full well that launching the bombers against Iran once again is not a war-winning strategy. We bombed Iran for 40 days, starting on February 28th and going up to April 8th. We had this 40-day campaign. We lambasted Iran with the Israelis, and it didn't work. That's why we went to the blockade. Now they've discovered the blockade's not working, and there's no hope of Iran surrendering anytime soon. So the question is, what do you do? And that's why they're thinking about going back to bombing. But bombing, again, is not going to solve the problem. So what do you do if you're Trump? There's only one thing you can do to put an end to this war, and that's to negotiate a deal with the Iranians where you may get some concessions in the end, for sure, especially on nuclear enrichment. But you're not going to get major concessions. And furthermore, it's going to be clear to almost everybody that Iran won the war. And Trump would then have to eat humble pie. And he's not up to eating humble pie at this point in time. But that's the only off-ramp here, unless he wants to just continue the status quo. But that has disastrous consequences, as does bombing Iran. So he really has no out here except to cut a deal.
If Iran has used the ceasefire to restore missile sites and deploy mobile launchers across the country, that suggests it's not de-escalating, but preparing for the next phase. So the question is, does this shift the balance toward deterrence, or does it make renewed conflict almost inevitable?
Sure. And, Larry's well plugged in with the intelligence community. And as we all know from reading the newspapers, the intelligence community has been saying that. The major media sources have been reporting that the intelligence community has made it clear to the president that we did not do as much damage to the Iranian military in that 40-day bombing campaign. And number two, the Iranians have recovered a lot of their damaged assets. They've repaired them. And number three, you want to remember that when countries fight wars, this is true of all countries, not just Iran, but the Iranians learned. combat is a learning process, and they've figured out all sorts of things about how to wage war against the United States and Israel more effectively. And finally, as we were talking about before, the Russians and the Chinese are helping them. It's not like the Iranians are on their own at this point. They're getting help from the Russians and the Chinese. And all of this just adds up to the fact that launching a new bombing campaign is just not going to do much for you. I do believe, however, that one interesting question that's on the table that I've been trying to find out what the answer is to, but can't, is whether or not the Saudis and the Qataris and even the Kuwaitis told us that we couldn't use their airspace. In other words, if I'm playing Saudi Arabia's hand, then it looks like the United States is going to launch another bombing campaign. Don't I have an interest in conveying to the Iranians that I'm not going to be part of this operation? Therefore, I don't want you, Iran, to attack me, Saudi Arabia. And that means I'm going to prohibit the United States from using my airspace to attack you. And I'm not going to let the United States use my air bases either. Now, the question is, did that happen? It is possible that it happened, because if you're playing Saudi Arabia's hand, even the United Emirates' hand, you do not want this air campaign to start up again, because it's very likely that the Iranians are going to pound your country and maybe even wreck it if they go after the desalination plants, the oil and gas infrastructure, and so forth and so on. The Iranians have a very powerful hand to play here, especially vis-a-vis the Gulf states. And the Gulf states, having seen what happened in the 40-day war, or the 40-day bombing campaign, have surely concluded that starting this back up again is not in their national interest.
I think it's quite clear that when you speak to Iranians, of course it is all anecdotal on my part, but also polls do indicate that there is a strong sense of empowerment among ordinary Iranians, and that they were able to defeat the superpower. Of course, the regime was defeated in the 12-day war pretty easily by the Iranians, and even though they carried out a blitzkrieg attack and had the full logistical support of the United States, after 7-8 days, it was the Israeli regime that was seeking a ceasefire. But in this war, you had a broad coalition. It was not just the United States and the Israeli regime. It was these countries in the Persian Gulf. It was Jordan. It was even countries like the Republic of Azerbaijan and Turkey that were assisting directly and indirectly. And of course, the collective West, the Europeans, through their indirect support, maximum pressure sanctions, all of these combined failed. And that gave the Iranians a strong sense of empowerment. Of course, there are concerns about the economy, about inflation, which is hitting ordinary Iranians, factory workers who've lost their jobs, or factories that have been destroyed. There has been significant damage done as well, but I think on the whole, the Iranians feel confident about their future, with apprehensions as well. I think, though, perhaps it's hard to say for me, but I think a lot of Iranians perhaps feel that the second wave of the second assault by the Americans will be more severe, that it will be possibly accompanied by a land offensive, but also support for terrorist groups in Iraqi Kurdistan, northern Iraq, and Takfiri Salafi groups on the border of Pakistan, in the no man's land inside Pakistan, where it's not well governed by the Pakistani government, and terror groups in Iran that they've been preparing. But ultimately, the Iranians are confident that they will overcome. I see a very the younger generation has changed a lot over the past 2.5, 3 months. My own students that I'm in contact with have changed a lot. Their worldview has changed. Their self-confidence has changed. They see They've before, I think they never really imagined Iran to have these, many of them at least have the capability that it has shown today. But I believe that we still have tough weeks and months ahead, not just Iran, the entire world. One thing that I think has led us here is not just hubris and arrogance, but also the narrative that has been dominant for 47 years. This Orientalist worldview of a backward Iran that is, and that's the same is true about China. And, the city that you're in, I visited once. And even visiting there was so eye-opening, even though I visited China many times in many different cities. But when I went there, I was so shocked to see how across China the country had advanced so much. It was not just Shanghai. We hear about Shanghai or Guangzhou or Beijing, and then there are cities that people have never heard of. But when you go there, you're just in total shock as to how clean those cities are, how advanced they are, how beautiful they are. And the same is true about Iran. So because we get our information about the world largely from the West still. I learn about China, even though I've traveled to China often, I still, throughout my life, I've been hearing news from China from Western sources. And news about Iran also comes from Western sources. Iran is a backward country. It is medieval. It's run by mad mullahs, whatever that means. It's corrupt. It's falling apart. It's unpopular. The people hate it. And then if that's the case, then of course it makes sense to just give it a little, and then it's like a house of cards. It makes sense. So they create this narrative using these Iranian expats who are on the payroll and these Iran experts who are linked to corporations and the Zionist lobby who will repeat what needs to be said. But then when they implement that policy, they hit a brick wall because the narrative is completely detached from reality. The same is true with China. The same is true with Russia. The same is true anywhere where the gap between reality and narrative is enormous and the other side is powerful. And I think that Iran is probably now, I don't know if one can say the fourth most powerful or not, but it is a superpower of sorts, and it has shown itself to be so.
I just want to say your voice on Iran really matters. Without independent platforms, many of us would still believe the mainstream narrative. From what I've seen firsthand in places like Serbia and Donbass, the gap between media and reality is huge. So the question is, how do we break that narrative gap at scale and get more people to actually question what they're being told?
You're very kind, absolutely. And thank you again for your kind words. I am very honored to be on your show and to have been on the show of all of these friends and all of these people and their viewers and this broad network of people who are part of these communities. They're all heroic in the sense that they're all resisting injustice and trying to bring about greater sanity. And I hope that after the war, more people do come to Iran, and all of you and your viewers would be welcome in Iran. There's actually a couple of good books that I have been speaking about on some of these shows that, at least for the time being, would be good for some of your viewers to read. One is called Going to Tehran by Flint and Hilary Mann Leverett. They were two White House officials who wrote this book. I think it's a very good book. Another by Alice, who is now on many of these shows, a former British senior official. He wrote a book on resistance, the axis of resistance, but it's called Resistance, the Essence of the Islamic Revolution. And for some people who are interested in the nuclear program, because that has been the excuse, or at least one of the excuses for Trump to begin this slaughter and this global crisis, a very brief book actually called, I think, A Dangerous Delusion by Peter Oborn, who's also an excellent writer and commentator in the UK. But just being in your city for me was an eye opener. Just walking at night alongside the river and just looking around by itself destroys so many of those stereotypes that we're brought. And I think that the more we learn about one another, the more these narratives shatter, and the better it is for the world. What we are experiencing today is an empire that is using false narratives to justify aggression and oppression, and many people believing those narratives, whether they watch Fox or CNN. The rest of them are not much better. They're the same. Are perhaps less drastic, more subtle, and more sophisticated, but they are still tools of the Epstein class, the empire. But we are reaching a point where many young people are waking up, and I even though there's no doubt that there are dark days ahead, but I think that things will ultimately some change for the better.
Enriched uranium is still a core sticking point. Iran isn't willing to give it up, while the U.S. wants strict limits. So the question is this heading toward compromise or just buying time before escalation?
Well, again, I would advise your audience to read that book, Dangerous Delusion by Peter Oborn, or there's another one by Gareth Porter called Manufactured Crisis. It tells the history of the Iranian nuclear program, shows very clearly that this is indeed a manufactured crisis, and that the United States has used the Iranian nuclear program as an excuse to demonize the country because that's what the Israeli regime wants. It's been an excuse used in order to target Iran so that we could get where we are today. Just as the armed insurrection that we saw a few months ago that they pretended was Iranian police forces massacring, 50,000, 100,000, 200,000 people in like 2 days. I don't know if that's even physically possible, or 40,000 or whatever number it is nowadays. All that nonsense was basically to prepare the grounds for war. There was an armed insurrection funded by the CIA and the Mossad. They brought in the weapons. They admit that, but Western media doesn't want you to know that. They don't want people to know that. Channel 14, which is linked to Netanyahu, said weapons were brought in. That killed hundreds of police officers by their own admission. And Trump has more recently admitted that they sent weapons for these people. So these weren't peaceful protesters. They killed hundreds of police officers. In all, 3,117 people died, most of them ordinary people who were caught in the crossfire between these terrorists and police forces in different cities. And this, along with the nuclear program, this atrocity that they are responsible for, this armed insurrection that they are responsible for, these terrorists that they are responsible for, this was carried out. And the excuses about the Iranian nuclear program, or the lies about the Iranian nuclear program, are the two key propaganda tools that are now used to fight the bombing of schools and universities and hospitals and ambulances. So whenever Trump speaks, he's either speaking about the nuclear program or he's saying that the Iranians killed tens of thousands of their own people in a couple of days or whatever. The nuclear program, by American admission, is peaceful. The head of U.S. counterterrorism, Joe Kent, who resigned recently at the beginning of the war, said that Iran was not pursuing a nuclear weapon, and that this is all about the Zionist lobby and the Israeli regime, the war. Tulsi Gabbard said under oath that Iran was not pursuing. The International Atomic Energy Agency also said that there has never been evidence that Iran was pursuing a nuclear weapon at any point. But again, when you want to destroy a country, you need an excuse. The United States, when it wanted to attack Iraq, they used, if you recall, they said that, your younger audience wouldn't know this possibly, but they were saying that in Kuwait, they threw babies out of incubators and took the incubators in hospitals. And then the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador, no one knew that at the time, but she made the claim in the United States. And the media went with it to demonize Iraq. Of course, Saddam Hussein illegally invaded Kuwait. But the point is that they used this lie, this false story, to mobilize American public opinion because half of America was opposed to the war. But ironically, in Gaza, the Israeli regime forces, they actually did unplug incubators in a hospital and leave the infants to die. But that was completely ignored in the Western media. And it was probably one of the most disturbing atrocities of this whole episode, to just let those children gradually die and get away with it, and Western media ignore it totally. So the nuclear program is a tool, but we've seen that before, like just in Libya and Viagra. Remember the claims about Viagra, or in Venezuela, it's drugs. There's always a reason. There's always a reason to justify death and destruction and oppression and empire. But I think it's, in the case of Iran, they've hit a brick wall. And this is going to be a turning point. I think Robert Kagan, this godfather of the neocon movement and someone who just hates Iran immensely, he was right. This is the greatest defeat of the United States militarily, and it is going to be a turning point. And hopefully it will lead to, in the distant future, less imperialism, and it will allow countries across the world to breathe more easily. And I think that's to the benefit of the people as well. The decline of the U.S. empire is a good thing for ordinary Americans, not for those people who you've been speaking about who've been making their billions by manipulating the markets, but it's going to be much better for the ordinary people in the United States and across the world. And hopefully one day we'll get there.
It does look like both parties are converging, especially on foreign policy and national security, where the differences are getting harder to see. So the question is this a real ideological shift, or has U.S. politics effectively become a one-track system with different branding?
I think that this whole concept of the Epstein class really goes above and beyond the political parties in the United States. This is a ruling class that is not affiliated to either party. But what is, I think, happening is that a great awakening, especially among the youth, is emerging, and not just in the United States, but across the West and across the world. But in the United States in particular, I think it's going to be a huge challenge for the ruling class, because the demands of ordinary people are a complete shift in policy and a focus on the needs of Americans and an end to the endless wars. And that brings greater conflict between the bulk of American society and the oligarchs, the ruling elites, the Epstein class, which we're going to see the infighting within the parties themselves. You see that on the right, you have the Tucker Carlsons and the Candace Owens and the others. And then in the Democratic Party, you see open rebellion as well. This is not something that's going to be resolved easily, but I think becoming clear is that the Israeli regime and Zionism are going to suffer immensely, because for over 2.5 years, people have been watching genocide, and now they're seeing that their world is being damaged, their lifestyles are being wrecked because of this very same regime. Not just in the United States, but across the world, people are seeing that Trump, Netanyahu, and the Israeli regime and Zionism are bringing about misery everywhere, whereas people across the world say this is not our fight.
The United States is completely beholden, if not under the control of the Zionist lobby. And the other sort of a backstory here will be what happens Tuesday in a congressional primary in Kentucky for Thomas Massey, who has called for registering AIPAC under FARA as a foreign lobbyist, which it absolutely should be registered as such. The Zionist supporters, all these outsiders, these Israelis, including Miriam Adelson, who is an Israeli. She's not really an American. She's an Israeli. That's who she. That's where her loyalty goes first. They poured millions of dollars. There has never been an election in the history of the United States where this much foreign money has been poured in against one candidate. If Massey loses, it's going to show the power of foreign money. Yeah. But if Massey survives, and this is rejected, then that is going to send a devastating message to Trump, and it's going to, all of his attempts to attack Massey and smear Massey, they'll blow up in his face. I'm hoping that happens. I really do. And I know Massey's opponent, Ed Galron. I first became acquainted with Ed Galron 29 years ago when we were involved in. He was an active duty Navy SEAL at the time. He was the exercise coordinator for a U.S. military exercise that I worked on that was held actually in Jacksonville, Florida, of all things. Then I ran into him again a few years later in Panama as he and his family were leaving the country. And I liked Ed, but he's just allowed himself to be used as a complete tool of the Israelis. And I find that shameful on his part. I hadn't heard that. So did Vance came out and attacked Massey? Fuck Vance. I had held out some hope that he could have a representative, a moderate, an alternative to Trump. He's just another tool. He's chosen the dark side. We know that the Chinese and Russian have been coordinating on this new security architecture in the Persian Gulf. And they're both dead serious about this. They want to promote not necessarily a military alliance, but an alliance that is it's sort of a three-legged stool that it's anchored by Turkey, the Saudis, and the Iranians. Now, instead of having it focused on a Sunni versus Shia model, they'll have it as an Islamic model, which embraces both Sunni and Shia theologies. But the concept is that they will be the guarantors of security and push the United States out, and that is going to be a real shocker for the Trump administration in D.C. because they've become accustomed to just using these countries there as our vassals. We can do what we want. They have to follow us. We're too powerful. They need our dollars. That kind of thing. Because I keep emphasizing this point, and I apologize. People get tired of hearing me repeat it. But there are basically two pillars that are undergird the U.S. Hegemonic role, being the king of the hill in the world. One is that the United States could finance its deficits on the back of foreign countries, that other countries would always buy U.S. debt, always invest in U.S. treasuries, regardless of what was going on in the world. So the United States always had that as a sort of a guarantee. We could run up deficits as we are. We're approaching $40 trillion right now. But other countries would buy our treasury bills. Then the second, and related to that, was the petrodollar, that any transactions in international commerce, especially in purchase of oil, you have to do it with dollars. If you don't do it with dollars, you don't buy it. That was the belief. Well, that's come unraveled. So we're seeing on both fronts that there is a move away from the petrodollar. It's not overwhelming yet, but the Chinese yuan is beginning to take a larger and larger share of the market in terms of purchases of oil. And the Russians have declared, hey, we're going to purchase with Chinese yuan, or if you want to buy our oil, pay with yuan. That is, one of the things I'm sure that Putin and Xi will be discussing, how they can continue to pursue and expand this project, because China also has been instrumental in setting up an alternative to the SWIFT system with SIPS, the cross-border interbank payment system. So you get away from the petrodollar, where you have alternatives, so that Brazil's buying oil with the yuan, the same with Russia, etc. Then you got the debt. And instead of China buying more, they're selling it off. The Japanese are selling it off. So all of a sudden, the United States is unable to sell the bonds. It's got the bonds for sale, but nobody's buying. And if they don't buy, you're not bringing cash into the U.S. monetary system. And so then that sets the stage for a recession on the part of the United States, where it no longer can finance its deficit, or unless we borrow against ourselves. So those are the two things at work, and I'm sure that's part of the strategic discussion that Putin and Xi will be engaged in.
Israeli media is already warning about serious manpower shortages, especially with ongoing operations in southern Lebanon and talk of expanding control. So the question is, even if they take territory, who is actually going to hold it? And can they realistically sustain that kind of long-term presence?
Well, Israel's between 8 million and 10 million people, depending. The country had its population had increased to around 10 million, but with the start of the war on October 7th, 2023, a number of people bailed out of the country. So you look at the size of the Israeli armed forces right now. So they're reservists. So you don't have a big standing army. You have the reservists that make up the bulk of the force. I think last number I saw, they had activated like 300,000. That is the size. If you look at like the size of the army in Turkey, that's the size of their army. So I think I was just looking up while we're talking just to make sure. Yeah, so the peak mobilization in the wake of the October 7th attack was they activated 300 to 360,000 reservists. Now, since then they've dropped down much lower. But when you look at total capability, Israel total number is like 400,000. So if you're going to conduct a military operation in Gaza, and using ground forces, and a military operation in southern Lebanon, and ground forces, and a military operation in Syria, you stretch their assets beyond what they're capable of. I mean, look, the United States, the current size of our army is 452,000. And we got a population of 310 million, 320 million to draw from. Israel's trying to put 400,000 in action out of a population of 8 million. Sorry, those numbers just don't work.
Trump is weighing an $11 billion weapons package for Taiwan, but the real issue is bigger. The U.S. isn't backing down on Taiwan regardless of party or leadership. So the question is this pure escalation, or is there some quiet trade-off with China happening behind the scenes?
The United States is engaged in a fraud. Hey, Nima, how would you like to buy a Lamborghini from me? I need $50,000 from you up front, and I'll get you that Lamborghini. And then you're going to say, well, where's the Lamborghini? Oh, I don't have it yet, but I will. So I'm selling you something I don't have. And in this case, the United States is offering to sell Taiwan weapons it does not have. It doesn't have inventories of these sitting around that it can, like Patriot, PAC-3 interceptors for Patriot missile batteries, or THAAD missiles for that terminal high altitude area defense interceptor. It doesn't have ample supplies of JASSMs or cruise missiles or, the Tomahawks, because it still has to make them. But to make them, they need, and we're back to what we, I think, talked about earlier, rare earth minerals. Without those rare earth minerals, the United States can't produce those weapons. And if you can't produce them, you can't deliver them. But nonetheless, we're offering them for sale. So that's why I see the Chinese sitting back and said, okay, go ahead, sign the deal. They're not going to get upset because they know that they're sitting on the rare earth minerals and they're not sending any to the United States. So the United States can sign all these imaginary deals at once, but it does not have the ability to actually produce it. That's the key.
What you will say about Pakistan that is positioning itself as a connector, maintaining ties with Saudi Arabia, Iran, China, and even improving relations with Russia, signaling a clear eastward strategic shift.
Pakistan is the pointy end of the spear for China. So the emergence of Pakistan as the major intermediary between the United States and Iran has been at the behest of and in coordination with the Chinese. And at the same time, the Pakistanis are keeping the Russians informed as well. So, Pakistan's they're a major player here. And to that extent, they have a security agreement in place with Saudi Arabia already. Now the question is, who are the Pakistan going to protect the Saudis against? And I think a case it can be actually the United States. Now, it's true that Iran launched attacks against the Saudis after the Saudis allowed their air bases, both the PSAB and KF, the King Saud or King Fahd, the KFAB, the King Fahd Air Base, were used to launch attacks on Iran, and Iran retaliated. But, Iran really, in some respects, looking back on it now, I think that they pulled their punches against the Saudis because they weren't really looking to completely devastate the Saudis. And as long as, I think this is in part because both there's pressure from China, pressure from Russia, pressure conveyed via Pakistan to try to get the Saudis and Iranians completely united now against the United States, which if that happens, then there's not going to be a renewed war. That's the good news.
Turkey is playing a careful balancing act, maintaining economic ties with Israel while publicly positioning itself as a defender of Gaza and the Palestinian cause. So the question is Ankara preparing to take a more active role? Or is it deliberately staying in the middle to maximize its strategic leverage?
Well, I'm not sure they are clear on their strategy. They've had a variety of strategies. I mean, if Erdogan's left his own, he wants to recreate the Turkish Empire, if you will, the Ottoman Empire. And to that extent, he wants to create this alliance that stretches through the Caucasus, through Armenia, through Azerbaijan, to make Turkey the preeminent power again in the region. But then you gotta wonder: are the Turkeys, the Turks, listening to the Israelis, to the former president and maybe soon to be new president, where he identified, he says, once we take care of Iran, we're going to need to take care of Turkey. I don't, how do you get that direct of a threat and that Turkey doesn't do everything in its power to pull the plug on Israel. I mean, the Turks continue to allow oil to flow to Israel, even though Israel is now threatening to destroy them. I mean, I don't get it. It's like the Turks have no self-respect. You know, at that point, the Zionist thugs they've declared what they're about, so you better deal with it. So that's where, Turkey they got to figure out, I'd say they're like in a sexual identity crisis. They're born male, but they keep entertaining the possibility they may be female. So they're like a transgender crisis. Am I this, am I that, am I this, am I that? Figure out what you are. If you're a nation and got any national pride, then understand the country that represents the greatest threat to you is Israel, nobody else.